It could be argued that the Roman Empire was the world's first superpower. At its height, in 117 CE, it stretched from the misty lochs of Scotland to the balmy banks of the Nile, swallowing up a huge portion of Europe and a slice of Asia, along with a chunk of North Africa. From its humble beginnings as a few scattered villages on the banks of the River Tiber, Rome underwent 500 years of transformation to become a cultural giant and home to around 70 million people. Through years of violent warfare interspersed with periods of peace and prosperity, Romans developed concepts, amenities, and structures that helped to sustain and expand their empire. 1,500 years later, many of their ideas still influence our world today. Our laws and government, the technology of water systems, construction styles, engineering and literature all have their roots in the Roman civilization, and the empire's later adoption of Christianity as its official religion had a considerable impact on the development and growth of the faith across the globe. Let's take a look at this Roman world from Caesar to Constantine and art to architecture. Welcome to the Roman Empire. Mythical Beginnings. The origins of Rome's foundation are shrouded in myth. The earliest written account of the fable emerged around the 3rd century BCE, when we are told Rome was founded on a murder. The story that paved the way began with the legendary figures of Romulus and Remus. The twin brothers were born in the ancient Latin city of Alba Longa. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was a Vestal virgin. Their father was, supposedly, Mars, the god of war. Seen as a threat to their jealous great-uncle, King Amulius, the boys were abandoned and left to die on the banks of the Tiber River, but were found by a she-wolf who took them to her lair and suckled them. As the twins grew, so did their dreams for a city of their own, but they argued over which of the 7 hills to build the city upon, and soon Remus lay dead by his brother's hand, and Romulus became the first king of Rome in 753 BCE. Rome expanded steadily, and by the 5th century BCE, it ruled over around 35,000 people. 7 legendary kings were said to have ruled Rome until 509 BCE, when the last one was overthrown. All of them were chosen by the Senate rather than through succession. It was under the rule of the last 3 kings that the early political system of Rome was established. The elite class believed they owed their loyalty not to the state, but to their clan. Those aristocrats who could trace their lineage back to the founders of their clan became leading men in Rome. The Romans believed their kings to have invested authority imperium. This gave them the right to give orders and demand blind obedience. Those who disobeyed could expect to be punished or even executed. Imperium also included the power to enlist citizens into an army that would go beyond the gates of Rome to attack anyone who challenged that authority. Long after the end of the monarchy, the weight of imperialism would remain and be used to justify and legitimize brutal acts that we would consider genocidal today. Each monarch left his mark on Roman society and the culture and traditions to follow, whether that was ushering in the earliest forms of Roman laws, introducing the divisions of social hierarchy, such as the patriarchs and the plebeians, expanding the city boundaries, or construction. The 7th and last of these kings was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, known as Tarquin the Proud, who was said to have gained the throne by murdering his wife, his older brother, and assassinating his predecessor. As his nickname suggests, he was not popular, and his authoritarian rule and decades of resentment for the aristocracy led to an uprising that heralded the dawn of the Republic. The Age of the Republic. 509 BCE was a decisive moment in the history of Rome. As far as the traditional story goes, it was Sextus, the son of King Tarquin the Proud, who brought down the monarchy, when he raped the noblewoman Lucretia. Unable to live with the dishonor, she died by suicide, and Tarquin and his son were driven from Rome. Like the story of Romulus and Remus, there is probably more than just a little embellishment to the tale of the coup d'état that brought about enormous political change. Although not quite a democracy, the Republic, the word means public good, or the state, was not quite a democracy, but rather an oligarchy, where a small number of people held all the power. A system of government overseen by two annually elected officials called consuls, sort of the equivalent of a president or prime minister today. Only two people were sharing the role. Being elected together meant they would, hopefully, moderate one another's actions. Then, as a throwback to the age of kingship and imperium, the consuls created another role, the office of dictator, someone who could restore order over the state in an emergency. Now the common people of Rome had a say, and their will mattered, right? Well, not really, because the consuls were chosen by the Senate, full of rich and powerful patricians, the leading men who could trace their lineage back to the early days of Rome. Therefore, the ordinary citizens or plebeians, the artisans, farmers, and merchants, had to fight to be included in Rome's significant political and religious institutions, and did that by holding a strike. When Rome was threatened by an invading force in 494 BCE, the citizens stood together on Aventine Hill, put down their weapons, and refused to fight. The people wanted their own representation, not one provided by the patrician elite, and they won. So they created an office within the Republic for their own interests, and 10 plebs were elected every year as tribunes of the people, to protect the commoners from any abuse of power coming at them from the Senate and the consuls. In 449 BCE, the 12 Tables were proclaimed. This legislation was the basis of Roman law and united what were once just unwritten traditions into an enduring set of laws. The 12 Tables have been described as a code for the citizens of the Republic to follow, whether plebeian or patrician, and it remained the basis of Roman law for 1,000 years. It covered a range of issues including the safeguarding of civil rights and property rights to provide fairness for all Romans and keep peace within the city, as well as establishing the definition of what constitutes a capital crime, be that intentional murder, treason, perjury, or jury tampering. The sack of Rome. The early years of the Republic was a time of great expansion. First, Rome allied with the nearby Latin communities to form an alliance known as the Latin League. Together, they dealt with the problem of the hill tribes of central Italy. Next, they looked to the north and set their sights on Etruria. Some of the Etruscan cities were happy to ally with Rome, but Veii held out. In 396 BCE, the Roman statesman Marcus Furius Camillus, who had been elected dictator, led the siege of Veii. By digging a tunnel under the walls, the Romans were able to overwhelm the inhabitants, and a general massacre took place. With the survivors enslaved, the city was consequently repopulated with Romans. Camillus was happy with his loot, and the Republic had increased its size, but it had also brought itself to the attention of some other ambitious people. And it was those fierce and ambitious people, the Gauls, who hammered the Roman army and brought the Republic to its knees. The Gauls were made up of many Celtic tribes. Their homeland of Gaul was in Western Europe and included lands across modern-day Germany, France, and Switzerland, as well as the Benelux countries. The invasion in 390 BCE brought down the might of the Gallic warriors, wiping out everything in their path on their march through northern Italy. It was to the north of the city-state, on the banks of the River Allia, a tributary of the Tiber, that the battle took place. The Senones, one of the Gallic tribes, led by King Brannus, defeated the Roman legions, who fought alongside every other able-bodied man from Rome. Then Brannus and his men turned on the city, leaving it a burning shell. Those Romans who were unable to flee holed up in the citadel, but after running out of food, had to surrender and negotiate their way out of trouble. Eventually, the Gauls were happy with their ransom of 450 kilograms of gold and went on their way, leaving the Roman people to lick their wounds. Like a phoenix. Considering that they had just had a monumental kicking, what happened next is all the more extraordinary. Under the direction of their military hero Camillus, any uprisings in the Latin area were suppressed, and within a year, Rome had been rebuilt. By 264 BCE, Rome had expanded once again to encompass almost all of modern-day Italy, and its legions had finally defeated the Samnite tribes at the Battle of Aquilonia. This was after about 50 years of fighting over a series of 3 wars that had also dragged in other Italic tribes at differing times. Now the Romans were the undoubted rulers in Italy, but they hadn't yet come up against the big players of the Mediterranean, the Greek kingdoms and the Carthaginian capital, Carthage. The Pyrrhic War. Pyrrhus was the Greek king of Epirus. In 282 BCE, the Romans had a little bit of a falling out with some Tarentine diplomats over the sinking of some Roman ships and declared war on the harbour city of Tarentum. The Tarentines asked King Pyrrhus for help, probably because he had a strong army and war elephants to back him up. Pyrrhus, who was the cousin of Alexander the Great, saw this as a perfect opportunity to grab a bit of land for himself and agreed. With 25,500 men and 20 war elephants, Pyrrhus landed in Italy in 280 BCE. After defeating the Romans at Heraclea, he marched on Rome, but in danger of being flanked from the north and south. Pyrrhus withdrew and only just managed to scrape a victory at the Battle of Asculum, where his army was decimated, causing him to declare, "If we are victorious in one more battle against the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." After leaving Italy to help the Sicilians fight an invasion from Carthage, Pyrrhus returned to meet the Romans once again at the Battle of Beneventum, where Consul Manius Dentatus was victorious and captured 8 elephants. Pyrrhus withdrew from Rome once again and died in battle in Argos, Greece in 272 BCE, driving Tarentum to surrender to Rome. The Punic Wars. A series of wars broke out between the years 264 and 146 BCE that would completely reshape the political framework of the Mediterranean Sea. And while one empire would emerge as a dominant victor, the other would be wiped from the earth forever. The Carthaginians were based in Carthage, now modern-day Tunisia. The Carthaginian Empire was a major power encompassing Corsica, Sicily, Sardinia, southern Spain, and most of North Africa. The city of Carthage was the center of the empire and one of the ancient world's largest and richest. Because of its wealth from a successful maritime trading network, Carthage was able to develop a powerful naval force to protect its shipping routes, with skilled mariners and navigators. According to the Greek historian Polybius, the Carthaginians were more exercised in maritime affairs than any other people. In contrast, at that time, Rome had hardly any naval experience to speak of, but then they found a Carthaginian warship that they were able to reverse engineer. On taking the ship apart, they were delighted to find that each piece was coded. Like a box of flat-pack furniture, the Carthaginians were mass-producing their ships, and now the Romans were quick to follow suit. It took 23 years for what was almost exclusively a sea war to end. On land, the Carthaginian army was badly defeated at the Battle of Acrages, and when the garrison escaped, the Romans sold 25,000 of the city's inhabitants into slavery. Then, in what is thought to be the largest naval battle in history, the Romans were victorious again at Cape Ecnomus, off the coast of Sicily. Carthage turned the tide at the Battle of Phintius and heavily defeated the Romans. But it was tit for tat, and the war continued with neither side gaining an advantage until both empires were almost bankrupt. Then, in 218 BCE, in a sneaky but daring maneuver, the Carthaginian general Hannibal took an inland route across Spain and France to lead his army for 15 days over the Alps and into northern Italy. He arrived with 26,000 men and several elephants, forcing Rome to abandon its plans for an African invasion. The Gallic tribes threw in their lot with Carthage, and Hannibal's force swelled to 37,000 men. The Roman army suffered a series of humiliating defeats, including the battle near Cannae in southern Italy, where, in what has been described as Rome's greatest military disaster, at least 67,000 Romans were either killed or captured. All his victories led Hannibal to the gates of Rome, but without reinforcements, he decided against a direct attack. Slowly, the tide turned for Rome, and by 203 BCE, after spending almost 15 years of warring in Italy, Hannibal went home. In terms of its military fortunes, Carthage was in rapid decline, and the threat of a Roman invasion from General Scipio Africanus was imminent. In 147 BCE, it was the third and final Punic War that led to the downfall of the Carthaginians. Now it was the Romans' turn to take control when they landed an army of 50,000 men 22 miles north of Carthage, demanded a surrender of all arms, and that the capital be burned to the ground. The Carthaginians dug in, and after a siege that lasted 2 years, the Romans finally broke them. With Scipio Africanus the Younger, grandson of his namesake, in charge as consul, a major assault was launched that captured the main square of the city. Then the systematic slaughter began, with the killing squads of Romans cutting and stabbing anyone they found before setting fire to the streets. It took 6 days to clear the city, and it was only on that last day that Scipio began to take prisoners. The ancient city of Carthage, once the center of an empire that had ruled over so many lands, islands, and seas, now lay in ruins as it was taken apart stone by stone. That same year, Corinth in Greece suffered the same fate for daring to challenge the power of Rome, and the Republic was now the master of the Mediterranean. Julius Caesar. In the aftermath of the Punic Wars, the Republic was on shaky ground, with power grabs, internal struggles, and an ever-widening gap between the rich and poor. In 60 BCE, it was 3 of the most powerful men in Rome who tried to pull the Republic together: Julius Caesar, Marcus Crassus, and Gnaeus Pompey. But only one of them was ambitious and ruthless enough to use the power of the people to cause the death of a republic and start the rise of an empire. That man was Caesar. Caesar was born into a patrician family. After running around running errands for governors and kings, he spent some time in the army before returning to Rome, where he was elected as a military tribune. He rose up through the political ranks and used his conquests in Spain and Portugal to prove his worth as a fighter and a general. On his return to the capital, Caesar stood for his first consulship and won. After the election, he joined together with 2 more influential politicians, Crassus and Pompey. The 3 men formed a secret coalition and promised to use their influence to support one another in what has been termed the First Triumvirate. After his year as consul, Caesar was given command of the Gallic provinces. He arrived there in 58 BCE and, with no legal authority to do so, brought together his 3 legions and embarked upon a series of campaigns resulting in a string of victories in the Gallic Wars to expand the Republic even further. During this time, he launched 2 invasions into Britain in 55 and 54 BCE and built a bridge across the River Rhine in Germany. Caesar's conquest of Gaul brought him untold riches and the status of a hero in the eyes of the Roman people. As far as the Senate was concerned, his job was done, and he was ordered to give up control of his army and return to Rome. There was a fear that Caesar had too much support and was getting just a bit too big for his boots. In 49 BCE, in defiance of the Senate's orders, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, a river that defined the boundary of Italy in the north. Now there was no going back, as he supposedly announced, "Let the die be cast," and marched down the country to Rome with his loyal legions. As Caesar ignited a civil war that went on for years, his one-time ally Pompey fled south. Battles were fought across Spain, Greece, and Egypt, until Caesar returned victorious and gave himself the title Dictator Perpetuo in 44 BCE. So much for the Republic. As dictator, Caesar introduced a broad range of reforms, brought in a building program, and centralized command of the military. He was also responsible for replacing the Republican calendar with a solar one. Now known as the Julian calendar, it is still used today. But his disregard for the Republican system and the blatant killing of his fellow countrymen made him unpopular. Just a few days after he assumed his lifetime dictatorship, a conspiracy had begun, and on the Ides of March, the middle of the month, Caesar was stabbed to death by a group of men who he thought were his friends and allies. But what those senators did not know, as they stood over Caesar's bleeding body, was that he was right. The Republic was dead. Augustus. What followed was a power struggle between those who aligned themselves with the assassins and those who followed Caesar's ally, Mark Antony. Having no children of his own, Caesar had adopted his great-nephew as his heir, and the 19-year-old Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus, born plain old Gaius Octavius and known simply as Octavian, quickly made his way back to Rome from military training to find Mark Antony, now in an uneasy peace with his uncle's assassins. Right away, Octavian walked around calling himself Caesar. After all, he had not only inherited his uncle's name, but also his estate and the loyalty of his legions. Octavian was inducted as a senator in 43 BCE, and it wasn't long before Consul Mark Antony and Octavian were at odds. Antony traveled to Egypt, where he united with Queen Cleopatra, who was once the lover of Julius Caesar and the mother of his son. The civil war still raged on among the Roman generals. Then, in 31 BCE, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, and the couple died by suicide. Now there was nothing in his way, and Octavian began to set himself up as the sole ruler of Rome. But he was clever enough to avoid the idea of kingship, and instead, in a nod to the Republic, styled himself as the first among citizens. In 27 BCE, Octavian was given the title of leader of the Senate, and taking the name Augustus, he began his reign as Emperor of Rome. What happened next has become known as the Pax Romana, or Roman Peace, a period of stability that was to go on for about 200 years. Yes, there was always going to be the odd uprising and skirmish here and there that was to be expected in such a vast area, but they were easily quashed by the Roman might. Under Augustus, the empire continued to expand. He annexed Egypt and conquered Spain and Portugal, areas of the Middle East and Central Europe. His vast wealth allowed him to build a network of roads across Italy and install a courier system of relay stations. Rome was transformed. Augustus stabilized the economy, created a professional salaried army. There was a census for fairer taxation, and within the capital, even a police force and a fire brigade. He established a pension fund for veteran soldiers. His building projects included magnificent edifices, such as the Forum of Augustus, as well as several temples to the gods. It's said that he found Rome built from brick and left it in marble. Culturally, the arts were supported, and a golden age of Latin literature emerged with writers such as Ovid, Virgil, and Horace, producing works that captured the principles and glory of an Augustan Rome. By bringing about peace, Augustus had pulled off the greatest trick in Roman history. Yes, there was a Senate, but no longer a republic, and ultimately there was only one man in charge, and the people were happy with that. Many consider Augustus to be Rome's greatest emperor, and his surname Caesar lived on to become the adopted title of every Roman emperor to follow. Not long after his death in 14 CE, the Roman Senate awarded him the status of a god. Good emperor, bad emperor. The years following the death of Augustus threw up three very unpopular emperors. The first of these was Tiberius, who succeeded his stepfather Augustus. By all accounts, he was a great general and an able politician, but couldn't get on with the Senate. After his death in 37 CE, the people wanted his body to be thrown into the River Tiber like any other common criminal. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, Tiberius was assassinated by his successor Caligula. He became emperor at the age of 24. Described as cruel, sadistic, and extravagant, he wanted to be worshipped as a living god and intended to make his horse a consul. His short reign ended in another assassination. After Claudius, who was supposedly poisoned by his wife Agrippina in 54 CE, came his grandnephew and adopted stepson, the notorious Nero. He came to power at just 17, with his mother Agrippina as advisor, but soon got fed up with his interfering mother and had her murdered. He would later go on to get rid of his wife and stepbrother in the same way. The revolt led by Queen Boudica in Britain was crushed during his reign, but when there was a rebellion at the Senate and Nero was declared public enemy number 1, he quickly scarpered and took his own life. The Roman historian Tacitus described Nero as compulsive and corrupt, and he was thought to have been responsible for causing the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD as a way to clear a site for his new golden house. Tacitus said that Nero, to deflect blame, accused Christians of starting the fire and had many of them thrown to the beasts, crucified, or burned alive. After his death, there followed another civil war which became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Things improved when Emperor Trajan came to power. He ruled for 19 years from CE 98 and was known as one of the 5 good emperors. The list also included Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius. Under the rule of Trajan, the empire grew to its largest territorial point. Then came Hadrian, who began building his defensive wall across northern England in 122 CE to place a boundary between the province of Roman Britannia and the unconquered Scotland. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the good emperors, ruled until 188 CE. He followed the school of Stoic philosophy, but his reign was marred by a war with Parthia and then with the Germanic tribes, before an outbreak of plague spread around the empire and wiped out about 5 million people. The decline of the Roman Empire began under the next emperor, Aurelius's son Commodus. The long drop. So power and greed ran riot, contaminated and pillaged everything, and held nothing sacred or worthy of respect until the Romans plunged themselves to their own destruction. Sallust. The next 300 years saw a slow, drawn-out decline in the fortunes of the empire. The first century had seen 12 emperors. By the third, there had been 29, a lot of them murdered by their own soldiers or supporters. Essentially, the empire had become just too big to manage, and the army wanted bigger and bigger bribes for their loyalty. By 225, the Germanic tribes raided across the borders, and Roman generals were fighting one another for control, instead of defending the frontiers. Then the plague of Cyprian broke out in 251, causing untold deaths and severely weakening the empire even further. In 270 CE, both the Gallic and Palmyrene empires of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt broke away from Rome during the imperial crisis, when the empire almost collapsed under the weight of invasion, civil war, and a crumbling economy. By 274, Emperor Aurelian once again united the Roman Empire and brought it back together by defeating the Gauls, Vandals, and Visigoths. But he too was assassinated. By the time the crisis was over, dozens of once vibrant cities lay in ruins, their populations decimated. The once thriving trading networks also fell apart and crippled the economy. Afraid for their lives, the major towns and cities of the empire, which had survived for centuries without defenses, now began to surround themselves with fortified walls. The empire was just too large, and it was too difficult for one single ruler to handle multiple threats at the same time. Because of this, Emperor Diocletian, a low-born military man, ended the imperial crisis and made the extraordinary decision to split the empire into 2 parts, the Greek East and the Latin West, in 286 CE. Diocletian appointed a co-emperor to rule the western side while he took charge in the east. Then he added 2 more co-rulers, establishing a tetrarchy in 293 CE, always ensuring that the presence of a Roman emperor was felt across different areas of the empire at the same time. Believing that he had solved civil conflict within the empire, Diocletian abdicated. However, his tetrarchic system collapsed soon after. You gotta have faith. Christianity rose to power in the 4th century after the Edict of Milan was made in 313 CE, and everyone had to be a little bit kinder to the Christians. Constantine the Great, who became the first Christian emperor of Rome, built a new imperial city in Byzantium in the east and renamed it Constantinople after himself. It became the capital of the empire in 330 CE and remained so for more than 1,000 years. The disintegration of the Western Roman Empire came early in the 5th century. There were large invasions from the forces of Attila the Hun and the Germanic people, causing the migration of thousands into Roman territory. The death toll rang when the Germanic warlord Odoacer overthrew Emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE, which is the date traditionally thought to mark the end in the West. In the East, however, Rome survived in what later became known as the Byzantine Empire, up until the city fell in 1453, when the last emperor died in battle, fighting Mehmed II and his Ottoman forces. The legacy. The Romans left behind an astonishing 400,000 kilometers of connected roads across its extensive empire. Its feats of engineering included such edifices as the Colosseum, with a capacity for 50,000 spectators, as well as many other magnificent amphitheaters across the realm. The Pantheon in Rome, built as a temple, boasts a concrete rotunda that is still the only masonry dome in the world not to have reinforcement. Many bridges, baths, mosaic floors, and frescoes still exist as a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of Roman life. They built the first aqueducts, like the Aqua Appia, in 312 BCE, which flowed for over 16 kilometers from a group of springs to the east of the city, almost completely underground, and fed the citizens with around 73 million liters of water every day. As well as these feats of engineering, culturally, we have inherited a set of government systems that are rooted in the Republic and have a lot to thank the Romans for, including art, language, and laws. It is astonishing to think that what was once a small spot on the banks of the River Tiber grew with the use of military domination to cover an area of over 4 million square kilometers and became the glorious empire that has left such a huge mark on humanity.